Thank you. So it seems like we have two options for the creation part of the work item process, at least two. Those are the initial two, and that is having a default type applied and showing corresponding widgets for that type. And then secondly, having no default type applied and an empty state for widgets until the user selects a type, and then the widgets will populate based on that particular type. And I talked with Gabe about it later, and I feel like he was also a little fuzzy on where we landed. Personally, I like the thought of not defining the type for initial creation, but I can see the benefit of providing a default type in some cases, you know, like maybe once we have relationships set up and you have certain child elements that can be created, maybe you only have one child element type that can be created. To me, that makes sense to provide a default type in that case. But just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Also, those questions, again, apply to that specific creation part. So that leaves a separate question for me of once the item has been created, can the type be changed at that point? I think this creates a better user experience. It gives our users more control over what they're trying to accomplish. But I feel like there were some concerns in terms of the relationship aspect, and I feel a little fuzzy on that, the level of understanding I have about that challenge as well. Melissa, would you like to maybe verbalize your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think option A, meaning showing choosing one default, makes sense to me. And I also feel like this feels like a two-way door decision to me, right? Like we could always change it later if we get feedback that it's not optimal. So for that reason, I think like I would be comfortable making a decision now, even if we don't have a ton of time for research.
So if we choose the default type for them, they have not yet created the work item. They're maybe still in the process of building the details for it, but we create it for them. And then can they switch it before it's created if they choose to? And if not, can they switch it after in the event that what we have recommended is not the path that is best, or perhaps they choose the wrong path for lack of education or understanding as to what those items are, or make a mistake?
I would say during the creation process, they should be able to change it.
But not after.
But not after eventually, right? But maybe not for the first MVC. But I also see where you're going. And I think there probably are a set of common elements between all work items, right? Like title, description, assignee, I don't know, others, right? We can brainstorm on what those are. And if we can identify those, then yeah, we could make it where there's no default type, like you said, right? And they just fill in the quote unquote basic details, and then like maybe even for an MVC, like none of the advanced ones show up until after, right? That could also be a possibility.
So the latest design does reflect that. It reflects the ability to change it until creation, but once created, that field for the selecting type becomes inactive, just read only. If the user adds in information to it, or for whatever reason realizes that they don't want that particular type applied, they will need to delete and then create a new version, correct? Okay. Yeah, I would definitely prefer to have the ability for them to change that down the line, but I recognize there are concerns in terms of scope with that, so that's why I wanted to bring this up here and talk through it.
So, I'm sorry, I'm still catching up on kind of all of the work items conversation, but are we planning on like looking at it kind of more holistically? Do we plan on having an option to create, like, is the user going to be able to see an option to create a new work item, or is it always going to be create a new issue, create a new incident, create a new epic? From within our UI, at least.
I don't know if that question was at me or just for everybody.
Everybody, but you can start with an answer if you have one.
I'm going to be a poor person for that then, because I was reading Alexis's comments and I missed the question entirely. So I apologize for that. If anybody else has thoughts, feel free to verbalize them. Or Donald, if you don't mind repeating, that would be great.
Yeah, essentially, are we planning on having an option for a user to create a new work item, or can they only create like specific work items? So like new work item versus new issue, new incident, new epic, new merge request. Yeah, basically that's the question.
I'm going to try to maybe rephrase it because I'm not sure I understand the question, but are you asking if we're going to give the user the ability to create kind of an empty work item versus a specific type of work item?
Even so, from say an issue view or today's issue view, a user can click on the new issue button. Are we still going to give that option and only that option, or are we going to say, are we going to replace new issue with new work item?
You mean in that specific context? Is that right?
Yes, but then also thinking more globally, like are we ever going to have, does it ever make sense to have a button that says create a new work item as opposed to create a new specific work item? Personally,
I feel this should be a decision made by the team because it doesn't just affect issues, but epics and various other parts of the product. My thought is that eventually we would want to have the ability to create kind of a blank slate item and give the user the ability to define its type. I think this goes into Gabe's long-term vision for extensible issues, giving them the ability to kind of customize that page layout for that particular type. That's my thought on it. And that whenever you go to a list of things, see, I think also this could change though how you filter things. Like it could change so much in terms of really creating a good user experience when you think that far out. For thinking a little more short term, I would expect that if you go into an issue list, this would be a good case, I suppose, for going to new. And then when you start to create that new work item, it defaults to maybe an issue. Same with Epic. You go into Epic list, click new, similar situation. We default to it, but if they choose to change it to something else, they could. I'm saying this on the fly though. I could also see there being some weirdness for users like, I'm in the Epic section and I'm creating an issue. Is that it's different from what I thought, so I want to think through that a little bit more and see what maybe the gotchas could be in that for the user.
Yeah, ideally, I think we would want to take into consideration the context in which a specific work item is created, right? If you're an epic list, you by default probably want to create an epic, but then also have the option to change that type while creating to an issue, because it's possible, right? You can have issues underneath epics. So it's not MVC definitely, but I think being context aware, if we can do that, that'll be way, way better user experience. But again, that's a tough one, I guess.
Yeah.
We'll need to see.
I agree. I think that especially more short term, we need to think about the context, but longer term, it almost seems like we will need to somehow kind of remove some context if we're going with something that's a bit more of a global object that is fully customizable. Then I would expect for some of those contexts to shift to still provide a good user experience, but that's way down the line.
Even like down the line, like I'm just throwing out there ideas, is that even if a customer defines a work item type that we don't even know about, right? If that's a list that's already filtered down by that specific type, I would assume that like you can have the button saying create a new work item type, but I guess you'd want it to be pre-filled with that specific type already when you click it. Like once you click it, the form will know that context that you are in a list of these specific work item types. So you'd probably want to pre-select that, even though giving the ability again to to select a different one. So this is where I'm trying to say that like being smart about the context in a way or another would be very, very cool.
Agree.
But like, I don't see us changing it in a very like near future, changing all the buttons from new issue, new incident, new anything to new work item. I don't think, at least, I don't think that's MVC. This is where I think it becomes like very confusing in a way, because you click new issue, but then you create an org item that I don't know how that works out from UX perspective. This is why I was more thinking, can we limit this new work item kind of stuff to a single work item, like maybe only 2 requirements? But again, I don't know how that works out. Like you are only in the requirements context, and having a new work item button, it like feels weird as well. So I don't know.
I think if you create
Maybe we can do something like keep the button new requirement, but then the form actually says work item or something, and then the type is selected as requirement. Maybe that's a way to introduce slowly the work item concept. I don't know.
It would be helpful for me to have, this is like a wish list, like a visual diagram of sort of the mid and longer and then longest term vision for this particular component. Like, what are we hoping to accomplish soon, and then later, and then long term? And what are the specific areas in which we hope to, launch certain things? I don't need dates or anything like that, but just what we anticipate to accomplish between now and then. That would help me, because these are all great points and questions. And I don't want to speak for Alexis, but I would imagine it would be beneficial to her as well, to think about all the various connections that might need to be made, such as context, when making these decisions. I'm happy to take a stab at it and see if that would be helpful, but would that be beneficial to anyone else? I'm sure I would need Gabe and Kristen's input and probably everybody's input to really be able to do anything of value.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. It will help us align into like what we, because like it seems we are going back and forth a lot between the what we want to do now and what we want to do next. And that seems, to me at least, that it shows what you just said. We don't have this kind of milestones or phases, longer phases where this is where we need to get. How do we get there, right? So that will be helpful, I think.
We did have to start with some of what Kirsten had put together, but it sounds like there's other things to consider. So I can pass this on to Gabe and Kristen for us to collaborate on that. If there are specific things that you want to be considered in this iterative plan, maybe we can start just inventorying those in Slack. And just say, like, here are the things that I like from you, Holly, from your perspective, and Alexis from your perspective, and anybody else, right? These are things that we need clarity on, and then that way we can make sure those are in the plan.
I think that's, are you referring to the MVC 1 epic?
Yes.
And 2 and 3? Yeah. I think that's been super helpful, and it's been a great place to start. It gets fuzzier though, obviously, the further out it goes. And that's where it becomes harder for me to try to understand what questions I'm going to have, because I think so much could still potentially change between now and then. So maybe some of it is just a matter of settling into that discomfort and dealing with the iterative process, that kind of happens there. But any insight that we have already as to what that long-term vision could be is just helpful in getting those questions answered. I'll put them though in those epics as those questions arise. That's probably the best way to go for now, just to keep everybody in the loop.
Yeah, and if there,
go ahead.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, if there are definite questions that you have that will affect the direction, right, that you're thinking, those are things that we should consider now rather than waiting.
Like my first question is, when do we start introducing the work item in the UI? Like work item as a phrase, as an object, as a whatever you want to. Well, like when does the user start interacting with an work item as it is? Because like we want to make it smooth, but I don't know if that'll work or it will be not confusing. Or do we rather still use the specified types like requirement, issue, incident, whatnot. And then when we have this new UI for the work items where you can change the types in between and all that worked out, then we do some sort of a release, some sort of an announcement that now we're going to use this work item versus all the different types. Like, I don't know how that plays out because like otherwise and I'm not a UX, I feel like there will be some sort of a disconnection and confusion that somewhere we call them work items, somewhere we don't call them work items, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we already have the start of some of that with issues, right? Because you can select a type, right? But I definitely see your point of like, if we're gonna have new terminology, if we're gonna have a new almost like model where these things are more together, right? What does that look like long term? Like one question that I myself have is right now requirements are in a separate part of the UI altogether. Like, is that what we want long term? Or are we just going to have a single work items list and just have better filtering, right? Things like that are useful to think through and have an opinion on so that we can align right on the direction. So yeah, I'll talk to Gabe and Kristen about this when they're back, because definitely like we'll need their input on this. And thanks for the link on story maps. I'll take a look at that to see if that's what I want to use. I've done story maps in the past and they are useful, I agree.
Alexis, looks like you have the next item. And actually, I know if you, you're doing good. You're doing good. I was going to say I'll verbalize your question if you need me to, but you're coming through.
Cool. No, I was just making sure we didn't skip anything. Yeah, just discussion, thinking about dependencies. Do y'all think about those as child items of a parent work item, or do you think of them as something else? And I added both those options if anyone wants to write it down or vocalize. So Holly, you have the first point. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just saying that I think they could be child elements. At least this is my expectation. They could be child elements. They could be siblings. They could be related in any particular way. What I would want to understand, though, is what the user's mental model is of relationships with these particular items. Does it differ between certain items? If so, why? So obviously the UXer in me has questions about that experience, but my short answer would be, I think it could be any of those things.
What about you, Melissa?
Yeah, so I do not think of them as children or parents related in that way. When I think children parent, I think of a work breakdown structure, right? Where you're taking like a big thing and breaking it down into tiny things and then rolling it up. And I think of these other things as like related, kind of like how we have that today. So a little bit different.
What about you, John?
Yeah, it's colored by knowing the way that these are implemented on the back end. But yeah, I just kind of think of, and this like came up at the start when we first started thinking about this, I kind of see them as the same, as in like it's a directional relationship in the same way that blocking is a directional relationship. Like in the UI, you can have an issue blocked by another issue, but on the back end, we store a blocking relationship that's directional. It's not two different things, it's one thing. it's the direction of the relationship that defines whether an issue is blocked by or blocking, but it's the same thing. And then you have related, and I see sort of child parent as just another type of relationship between two work items.
I agree on the back end, that's how we implement it. But like to me in UI, when you say something is dependent on something else, I would see them like structurally, at least in a sort of a tree structure as being child items. Because then for me, it's easy to visualize that all of these child items somehow roll up to this parent just because they are dependencies. And then if there is a different relationship, just things relate to one another, they not necessarily have to be child items, they just are related in one way or another. But when I like, or to put it in a different way, when I think of child items, I almost always think that they do have some sort of a dependency on the parent or the other way around, right? So at least like visually, this is easier for me to visualize that. Well, these things are dependent on this higher up item. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of confusing, right? Dependent versus like needs to be completed, like criteria that must be completed versus it must be completed because it's dependent. Like, what is that difference?
Yeah, I don't, to me, there is no difference. To me, the related item is something that does not affect the parent in any way. So this is where, because like on backend, this is still the same relationship, just we changed the type, the same thing, we changed the type of the relationship, but it's still same thing, same data structure in the database. But like from a user perspective, from a visual perspective, if this is dependent, then it affects the parents in one way or another. Maybe just it's hard linked to that. It has to be done before the parent is done, and it has some sort of an influence. But then also the parent can be related to some issues that just has some discussion, but has nothing to do with the completion, has nothing to do with the weight, has nothing to do with all other stuff of the parent, right? So then there is where it can be a child, but it doesn't have to be a child in my view.
That makes sense. Like it's not necessarily related, but it just needs to be completed, but not necessarily completing the items within that item that's blocking the current item. They won't necessarily like transfer over and help complete the current work item you're looking at. It's just that they're a step before that needs to be completed. It could be totally unrelated. So it's kind of like related versus not related dependencies almost. Maybe that's the, I don't know, it's all the same terms. My brain, it makes sense in my brain, but not when I talk about it. But I think the way you talked about it, Alexandria, like helped me click with that. So thank you.
Yeah.
I think Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say like in classic, called classic like project management, and like a lot of Agile has like come from that. The work breakdown structure, right? So how you decompose issues is treated separately as how issues affect execution and the order that you do work in, right? I was just looking through, because I used to use this when I was a project manager, RoadMonk. It's like a roadmap visualization tool.
I like roadmap,
yeah, there's a bunch of versions of this, right? But I was just looking, they also treat like the work breakdown. You would see that sort of like on the left handmost side, and you sort of like create children issues within it. And then dependencies are separate, where you like actually link to issues, and how they show that even visually on the roadmap is different, where like parent children are sort of like roll-ups and dependencies are lines between things. And related to me is sort of like an arbitrary thing, right? It can mean anything and nothing, right? And while we're on that, I really don't like that today, the minute you mention something, it makes it related, because sometimes it's not even related. It's just sort of like randomly mentioned. So We should see if
Yeah.
other people feel that way,
Maybe.
but I personally
No.
don't like it.
I think it would make sense to have just like a called out, like mentioned in section or like whatever, however we want to incorporate that instead of, you know, it's related automatically because that blurs that line
Yeah.
even further.
Mike
Like
Nichols,
like on Amazon, other things you might be interested in, right?
Mike Nichols has some really interesting ideas on using like hashtags and mentions to connect things in the product. So if you're looking for some ideas or some brainstorming, he could be a good one to talk to. We're at time.
Everything tag. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Exactly. I just wanted to mention that. I don't want to cut off the conversation, but we are at time. So if there is anything else, I'll just pause. All right. Well, everybody have a great rest of your day.